They are in a bad place and embarrassing. And that's not us talking. That's how former Speaker Kevin McCarthy describes the state of the House GOP, the caucus he once led. It is a party adrift, even as a series of very serious global crises demand Congress's attention. War in Ukraine, as we've been discussing, the conflict in the Middle East, not to mention a potential government shutdown now in less than 30 days. It's been 20 days since McCarthy was ousted from his position as Speaker, and Republicans are still going back to the drawing board about every 30 hours. Right now, 9 candidates are vying to be the party's official nominee for Speaker. They are set to meet with the caucus behind closed doors a few hours from right now. New York Times reports this. The lawmakers vying for the job include veterans of the House, committee chairman, a top member of the Republican leadership, and a sophomore. Virtually none have the kind of commanding national profile normally required of the Speaker, who is not only second in line to the presidency, but a key fundraiser for their party's efforts to protect and expand its majority. They will have to navigate the same treacherous dynamics of a bitterly divided conference that the 3 men before them could not, leaving some Republicans openly questioning whether anyone can win a majority of votes on the House floor. It should not be lost on anyone that Kevin McCarthy shares much of the blame for the paralysis in the House and the decline of the Republican Party. Here's his former deputy, Liz Cheney.
What we've seen is a result of really the leadership decisions that Kevin McCarthy made all the way back after the 2020 election and certainly after January 6th. And, you know, looking the other way in the face of the kind of assault on our democracy that we've seen from Donald Trump and his allies in the House, including Jim Jordan, elevating those members, frankly, some of whom are white supremacists, some of whom are anti-Semitic, a number of whom were involved directly in the attempts to seize power and overturn the election. So it's not a surprise when you see that those people have been empowered, but it's also
McCarthy really empowered dangerous. Them, right?
Now, the race to lead a party driven by extremists and, in the words of Liz Cheney, including white supremacists and anti-Semitic individuals, has been defined by the specter of violence. Members who opposed Jim Jordan's bid for the speakership have reported facing threats and intimidation against them, their spouses, and their kids. Here's what Cheney had to say about that.
The domestic threats are absolutely being driven by Donald Trump and unfortunately, some of his supporters who, in fact, have encouraged and taken steps that have resulted in, as we saw on January 6th, political violence. When you have a member of Congress, reportedly, like Warren Davidson from Ohio, who, in the meeting with Jim Jordan last week, when some of the holdouts raised with Jordan the fact that they were getting death threats, one of them told me that in response, Congressman Davidson said, well, that's not Jim Jordan's fault. That's your fault for voting against him. That is the kind of encouragement and acceptance of violence that is absolutely has no place in this party, should have no place in our country.
Joining our conversation, former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill and Miles Taylor. He's a former chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration, now a former member of the Republican Party. John's still with us. There's so much reaping what they sow, and it is a crisis to have the House in this situation.
Yeah, and I think, you know, normally what you have in it's internal caucus politics like this, you'll have like, oh, the speakership's going to be open or some leadership position's open. Oh, there's a lot of people who want that position. There's going to be chaos in the first few rounds of voting because there's a bunch of people no one's ever heard of, and they're going to split the votes, and eventually we'll, you know, settle on the consensus candidate. It's like they tried the consensus candidates. The consensus candidates are now gone, and now we're down with all these people who are not just, I mean, it's, again, even the ones who are less objectionable on some level are, it's ludicrous that they would be third in the line of succession or second in the line of succession as Speaker of the House. The succession of the presidency, it's kind of it's a ridiculous notion, and there is no prospect that any of these people, as a bedrock matter, are going to be able to put together the votes to be able to get the speakership. So we face potentially a prolonged period. We were worried about a government shutdown previously.
Right.
We now already have a House of Representatives shutdown, and that shutdown has already begun, and there is there's not a single realistic forecast by which anybody can play out the end game here of how we end up with a speaker, any speaker, who's going to be able to cobble together these numbers of votes. And I think from the straightforwardly political perspective, you know, Americans are really disengaged from politics. You know, they have a lot of things in their minds. They're not focused on this stuff in any detailed way. They have no idea that Jim Jordan tried 3 times. They don't know any of that. But it's gotten so big that it is pure, the notion of the Republicans who have the majority can't pick a leader among themselves and install a Speaker of the House, which is what they fought for in all of the 2020 to 2022 cycle. Now they're in charge of one branch of government and they can't pick someone to run it. That's the kind of thing that even someone who's not paying attention to politics at all in any congressional district around the country goes, is that serious? These people are clowns.
Let me just push. I mean, they may not have been paying attention until Donald Trump and Sean Hannity went all in with Jordan. Now everybody knows that their candidate lost.
Yes, and I just think that, when for a lot of voters who are the ultimate swing voters, persuadable voters, they look at this is a joke that a majority party can't just install a speaker, and that is the kind of thing that spells dysfunction, spells incompetence, spells you guys are out. Let's go back to the other party.
Right. I mean, Claire, were we at flip a coin? I mean, so the establishment guy, I guess, was Scalise. The Trump-Hannity candidate was the most giant loser of all because they had a plan for strategic humiliation to peel off more and more votes with every count. So he threw the towel in. And now where are we? We're at, spin the bottle. What are they doing?
Well, there's three questions that have to be answered. One, who do you believe won the election? And there's only two of these candidates that voted to certify a fair and free election of the American people. Only 2 of the 9 voted to certify the election. The second question, will you keep the government open? And the third question, will you support Ukraine? The problem is that if anyone answers with the correct answer on those 3 questions, they can't win. And if they answer the other way, they can't win. The appropriators aren't going to put up, the Armed Services Committee is not going to put up with a speaker who will not support Ukraine and will not support appropriations and will not support funding the government. So you either are going to lose the 10 crazy people, or you're going to lose the 10 people who believe the institution is worth preserving and not tearing down. So I don't know how they come out of this. I really don't. I don't see how they do it without eventually having people realize that the Democrats don't want to pick a speaker. They don't want to have a Democratic speaker. They just want to have a rules committee that's not controlled by the crazy caucus. I don't think that's a big ask.
Miles, I also am worried. Emmer and Scott voted to certify, but they also joined the Texas lawsuit. There is no one who's clean on the 2020 election.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nicole. And that's why I think the framing around this needs to change a little bit, because we're talking about this like it's a civil war within the Republican Party. And I want to flip the script on that, because I don't think it's a civil war in the Republican Party. I think what we are watching is the last dying gasp of the moderates in the Republican Party. There are a handful of moderates hanging on by a shoestring. And the data shows it. You go back and look, and 538 Blog did an analysis of this a couple of years ago. When Donald Trump came into office, there were roughly 293 Republicans in Congress, in the House and Senate. By the time he left office, those numbers had been gutted in half in terms of the moderates that were in Congress. Most of them got defeated in primaries or self-selected out. So during Trump's presidency, there was really a hollowing out of the center in the Republican Party. And Senator McCaskill refers to them as the crazy caucus. I actually would submit they're not even a caucus anymore. It's the whole Republican Party has now been overtaken by the crazies, and we're seeing the results of that. I look at that list that you showed on the screen of those candidates, and I see what I saw 2 years ago, which is that whoever is the speaker for the Republicans, it's going to be Donald Trump with his hand around the gavel. I don't think any of those people are going to push back against Trump, just like Kevin McCarthy was Donald Trump's spirit holding the speaker's gavel. I think almost any of those people, if they win, are probably going to cater towards Trumpism, even if they're trying to carve out a lane a little bit towards the center. That is the worry here, is we still have a party that's completely commanded by one person, one person's views, and one person's vitriol. That's what we're witnessing, is the dying gasp of the moderates and those extremists really cementing their control over the party. And as a result, we are seeing the chaos that is an output of those crazies taking over the GOP.